Hi, Alex here from Developer.com and welcome back to our Christmas calendar tutorial series. And in this episode, we are going to take it from where we left off in the other video, and we are going to explain how to build out these UI collection view controllers with the help of CollectionKit. So without further ado, let's get into the code. Okay, in the previous video I have shown you how you can build all of this up. Go ahead and take a look at that and download the resources so you can create all of these amazing UI collection view controllers in under 2 minutes, or maybe just a little bit more when you want to customize them. So we have built up our CollectionKit view controller, and this is what we got. Okay, we have embedded it into a navigation controller. We have a button here, we have a header and some cells, basic stuff. Now let me just show you the code of it so you may understand and reuse this code in later projects. Okay, now if you remember, we have created first of all our base of our collection kit, and I have added to this group base collection kit. Now here we have, and I will go through all over these files now in this video, and maybe some customization tips and tricks. Okay, first of all, we have our collection kit keys. Again, this base has to be added to your project, created in your project only once, and then you can edit it. Okay, let's see our collection kit keys. Well, this is just a struct with another struct for keys. This is to avoid typos, and you know I am a huge fan of structs, using structs to avoid typos. We will take a look at this in our models, and here we go. You can see that we are having this key as the collection kit keys base UID, and we are adding this UID as the value. We will take a look at the models in just a moment. So here we have our keys, avoiding typos. Document serializable. Now with the models, and we will get back into the models in just a moment, we are using document serializable, and this is just a protocol for our models. You will basically it goes through all of the elements of the model that are needed, and if we are not providing all of the elements at the correct keys, it will return nil. So no user or post will be created that can be added. And this is another safe way of creating models, well, a helper to creating safer models. And finally, we have our collection view controller. Now we could type this out for all of our controllers, newsfeed controller, profile page controller, but this is redundant, and we always want to instantiate a collection view. We always want to have a provider, and of course we always want to have our background to be white. We can change that later on in the newsfeed controller if we wanted to, and we always want to set the frame of our collection view to the views bound, so to cover all, the whole view. So that is basic stuff. Now what is this provider? As you will see in just a few seconds, we are going to populate the collection view controller with a data source, and that is, well, we are adding a data source as opposed to other types of approaches that, let's say, Apple uses, and this provider gives that data source to our collection view. We will just talk it in just a moment, and it will be whole and round and understandable in just a few moments. Okay. Next up is our newsfeed controller. Now, whenever we want to instantiate a new UIKit, UI collection view controller, we want to create a new controller for that, and that will create our new suite controller and our new suite controller layout. So let's take a look first of all for our layout. Now in the layout, and we will come back with customization options in just a moment, we have our header cell height. For now it is 150. If you want to avoid headers at all, then you should set this to 0. Now we have a compose provider and a section 0, and well, that is a provider too, but I have named this struct section 0. Now for the compose provider, that is setting the layout for the whole collection view controller. Now here we have some spacing, the spacing between the cells, top edge insets and the other insets. Well, that is for the inset of the whole collection view controller, like including the header too. Okay, and that is 5. And for the left edge insets, well, sometimes 4 works, 4 with 5 works. Make sure you tweak this, and I will show you an example that really it doesn't really add all of those cells like we are supposed to see them on the view. So you have to tweak these edge insets if you add them at all. Let's say either if it depends on the design of your UI. Now, here we have our new suite controller, and that is a whole lot of code to go through. But before we do that, let's jump into the it's insta post section. So let me just change that. And here we have our manager, our cell, header cell, and models. So before we dive into the controller, let's understand this section, because of course in a controller you can have multiple sections with multiple providers, and that is the awesome stuff of CollectionKit, that you can have multiple sections in your collection view controller. Now let's take a look first at the models, because we have 2 models, Insta user and an Insta post. As you can see, all of this is already set up for you with the help of those file templates. And what this does is basically, let's talk about the cell model first, this Insta post. It is populated with a dictionary, and with this extension for the document serializable, as you can see, we are coming to that too. We are guard-led unwrapping it. Let me just close this, and we are having this UID added, initialized with our UID property. There we go. And it will be as a string, of course. You can add in here integers, booleans, whatever you would like. And if you go just back to our keys, you can have a look at the struct user. This is just a simple example. You can have UID, name, email, profile image URL, username, or whatever. So you would need to go back in here and add all of these here and here, and before the else returns. And of course we want to initialize this, let's say with the name. Okay, we are not going to do that. Go ahead. It is self-explanatory to expand these models. And the same goes for our Insta user. I have only a UID. Well, maybe for our post we would have, let's say, post image URL. Here for our Insta user we would have a name or a username, or whatever the case. Okay, now let's take a look at the posts manager, and that is for fetching Insta users, well, for the one Insta user, and this is singular because we want to fetch the Insta user in our header. So that's only one header per section, and you need to do this because we are having this as optional, and we are setting this to nil. We are returning our fetched Insta user. But let's say you are connected with Firebase, then you need to fetch it from Firebase. So you could just simply add it like I did here with an example for the cells and then populate it, but that's no real use case of our fetch. But for the sake of showing up cells, I have added 20 cells with the InstaPost. As you can see, we have created our document data with this dictionary. And I have added for the UID the I, and that is loop through from 0 to 19. And we append our fetch InstaPost, our new InstaPost to our fetch InstaPost array, and we return it. So that is, we are basically in the manager, we're just simply fetching. You could expand this class for your situations. Okay, now let's take a look at the post cell, InstaPost cell. So it is quite a big one, so we will go through it line by line. First of all, we need to create a protocol, and this protocol, protocol and delegate will be used in the newsfeed controller. So we will have the InstaPost cell delegate added to our newsfeed controller, and here it is, InstaPost cell delegate. Okay. Now we have created our protocol, and this is a dit-tab InstaPost cell, and we add our view and data, then that is an InstaPost, the model that we have just created, and an index, the index of our cell. Now if we extend our InstaPost cell delegate with the same function, but we add these two parentheses here, then this will be optional, and I don't want to really make this delegate call required. You can use it if you wanted to, but let's say if you have an image and a button in that cell, you don't want to maybe require this dit-tab InstaPost cell. Only create a new protocol for the, let's say, the button has been tapped. Okay, so that is why I have set this to as the extension, and that will be optional. Okay, let's go to our cell. So it is a UI view, a simple UI view, and here we create our delegate, so we may use it in this view, and that is an InstaPost cell delegate. And here we have our data and index. Now at the creation of the cell, we don't really know this, so they are optional, and we will add them in the populate function that we will talk down below. Now here we have our inits, and the first one is init with frame. We create a common init, and that is simply having a setup views function in it. Yeah, pun intended. And we have our required init. Okay. Setup views. Well, basically here you can set up your views, and I have set the background color to be, I believe it's some kind of a blue, and here you can add your views as lazy vars, of course, and inside the setup views you just add the subview and anchor it. Now my favorite way of anchoring is tiny constraints. You can do whatever you want. We are going to stick with the background color because we are already can see the cells. Now here we have our handlers, and here it is, handle InstaPost cell tabbed, and first of all we are checking for our delegate. If first of all, it is optional, but if it is there, then we check for our data and the index, and then we trigger the dit-tab InstaPost cell delegate function. Now, as I mentioned earlier, here we have our populate function that is called, of course, in the newsfeed controller, and I will show you where that is in just a moment. And then we have our view, our data, and our index here. So we add our data and index. Of course, you can change the view if you wanted to, but this view is basically the view that we have here, our InstaPost cell. Okay, now this handle InstaPost cell delegate can be triggered, let's say, on a button, or if we wanted to, we can add it as we can add some gesture recognizers on the cell. We are not going to do that, but go ahead and use this handler to your liking. You could add here under views a button, and then for the target you could add handle instapost cell tabbed. Okay, and that is it for the cell. Now the header cell is kind of the same. We have our protocol. Now this time for the header cell delegate, it is extended, so it can be optional. We have our delegate. We have our view data, and that is the header data. Now the header data just contains an index, and I believe, let's see what else. Something with a header data, not really important. I believe that is, the view data will have our post, our Insta user. Sorry for this confusion. It will have our Insta user, but we will talk about that in the newsfeed controller in detail. Here we have our delegate, of course, view data, data, index, as same as with the cell. We have our command in it, our required in it, our setup views. We have our background crawler, and you can add your views here as properties and add them to the view in the setup views. And of course we have our handle instapost header cell tab that you can use to your liking. Okay, now that is it for our section. Now you can create a lot of sections, as many as you want, but before we do that, let me just, and we will talk about this in the next episode. So let's take a look at the main component here, our news feed controller, and how all of this comes together. Okay, now first of all, here we have our notification name that I will talk about when we are talking about triggering this notification name. Set section 0 data source. Basically this triggers will trigger reload data in the collection controller. Okay, of course we import CollectionKit, and this newsfeed controller, if you remember, we have created our CollectionViewController. Its parent, this newsfeed controller parent, is CollectionViewController, and it has instapost cell delegate and instapost header cell delegate there. So here are the delegate functions. Okay, did tap instapost cell and did tap instapost's header cell. Okay, and there we have our data as the instapost and our data as the insta user. So we can do whatever we want to when all of these cells are tapped, and we have a lot of information for the view, our index, and our data. Okay, let's just scroll all the way down and take a look at the cell size. I will come back to the cell size and the collection view animator 2, and the compose provider layout, section provider insets and layout. And let's first of all, we need to create a header composer. But before we do that, let me just talk about this section 0 provider elements, because here is where the magic of CollectionKit comes in. So just to rethink how we are going to build our UICollectionViewController. First, we need to provide a data source, and this data source is for the section 0. It will be an array data source. Now this is provided by CollectionKit, and all we need to do is with the instapost manager fetch our instapost. Now let me just jump into our definition and show you that this is basically an optional array of instaposts. So the instapost is our model that we have just created right here under instapost model. So here we go. It has a dictionary with UID, and it is required. So let's just jump all the way up. We are going to have our data populated here, or because this could return nil, we are returning an empty array. So that's that. Of course, this may return nil at the very beginning of our initialization, because and this data may not be ready, or it needs to be fetched from the server. So that is why we are going to have this empty array. But no worries, with the setup notification center observers, you can populate your data source as soon as you have your data, and we will come down to that in just a minute. Okay, let's go to the next important, and that is the view source. Now here you set up the view of your source, not the data but the view, and that is the InstaPost cell. And you could add it here. So let's say you want to change the views for the data and so on, but we have set this up in the populate. And let me just jump right into there, jump to definition, InstaPost cell, and if you can see here, we have our data and index. And now we can, let's say, set any views properties here. Let's say we have a UI label view, and we want to check set the name of this cell from the InstaPost name. Well, maybe for the Insta user, but let's say we have an InstaPost and we have some likes on it. Okay, so we can grab from the data that we have just gotten from our newsfeed controller, and then we can set it into our views. Okay, hope that was pretty clear. So we are going to populate it inside the cell. So that is why we are calling populate view with data and index. And of course we need to set the views delegate to self to have our did tab InstaPost cell delegate function to be triggered on this newsfeed controller. Now let's just scroll all the way down back to our view source. There we go. We have our view source, and then we need to set the size source, so the size of our cell. And here we have our index, of course, our InstaPost, that is the data, and the collection size. We are going to return a CG size, and we are setting this to be the section 0 cell width and the section 0 cell height. Now, what is that? So we are going to go all the way up here, and here we go, section width for the sizes. There we go, cell size. And here we have a lot of data, but bear with me, I will go through it step by step. So section 0 cell width. First of all, we grab our views frame width, so the whole width of our window, our UI view controller. Now we want to remove some numbers, and that is the compose provider's left edge inset. So the collection views inset from the left and from the right. We want to remove the cell provider's left edge inset and right edge inset. Okay, here we go. And then after that we are left with this. Now we have an option for the sections that we can add, and that is number of cells per width, and that is free at the moment. We have set it, we want to have 3 cells per width. So with the remaining space, we want to calculate that tiny fraction what the cell width is. And we do that, well, of course, we just basically we are going to remove those let's say insets. Well, no, the spacing. The spacing is the space between the cells. So we want to remove those 2 spacing between those 3 cells. And how do we calculate how many are there? Well, they are as many as the number of cells minus 1, because those are 2, we have 3 cells. And go ahead and figure it out. If we have 5 cells, we would have 4 spacings. Okay, so we just simply grab our number of cells per width minus 1. So in our case, this will be 2. Then we just simply multiply that with the spacing. In our case, that is 10 pixels. So we get 20 pixels. So we remove those 20 pixels too, and now we are left with only the width of our free cells. So what do we need to do to get our width of our cell? Well, we need to divide it by the number of cells per width. I hope that was pretty self-explanatory. It's kind of tricky, but it does the job. Okay, and because I want to have squared cells, then we could just reuse this section 0 cell width for our section 0 cell height, and that is because we are setting it as a lazy variable. Go ahead and take a look at the video on my channel for that too. So that is how we are composing this. And just a reminder, let's just jump into our newsfeed controller layout and take a look at the compose provider. Here we have our spacing, and that is 10. That is the distance between the cells. And as you can see, we have for the section 0 cell provider, we have a spacing too. Now this is overridden. So if we have 5 here and 10 here, 10 will be applied. Now, top edge inset for our collection view cell, as I told you, 5, 4, 5, 5. Or, you could set this to 0 if you wanted to. And here we have our number of cells per width, 3 as I mentioned earlier, and spacing 5. And of course here we have our top edge insets, just for example. Okay, let me just show you on a simulator. Now, here we have our, for the cell, for the compose provider, top edge inset, 5, left, right, and bottom. At the bottom, when we will go all the way down, it doesn't really you cannot take notice, but here we have 5. On the left we have 4. Now here we go, 4 and 5. Now for the spacing for the cell, here we have 10 and 10 and 10 as always. And another top, we have this top for 5, and as you can see, for the left edge inset we have 5, but it combines 4 plus 5, and here 5 plus 5. So that is pretty self-explanatory, and that is it for our controller layout. Of course, we have talked about the header cell height. Okay, let's go back. Okay, let's just scroll all the way down, or rather yet, while we are at it, let me just talk a bit about this collection view animator, and that is our fade animator. We can have a simple animator, simple fade animator, scale animator, wobble animator. You could just simply add it here, and the cells will be animated differently. Go ahead and take a look at this for yourself. Okay, now the animators can be assigned to collection views, providers, and cell, and they will be overridden by the parent. So the parent will be overridden by the child, and you can take a look at an example here. Now here we create the compose provider layout, and we are going to talk about this in just a moment. So let's just scroll all the way down where we left off. So we have our section 0 size source, if you can bear with me. Okay, now finally we have arrived to the view did load. We call super view did load and setup controller. In the deinitializer, we have our notification center default remove observers. That will remove all of the observers from our controller. That is because we are setting up our notifications and send observers as soon as we call our setup controller in the view did load. So we are setting our observers up, setting up views, animator, provider, and navigation items. So let's go through all of these one by one. Set up notification center observers. Now that is for maybe we are not going to fetch those data, as I mentioned earlier, right off the bat. We need some seconds, or maybe a few more seconds, for our data to be fetched. Now we can wait for this notification name set section 0 data source, and then if we do grab those data, then we want to fetch those posts again and add it to our data. section 0 data sources data. And the CollectionViewController will be updated automatically. You don't need to call reload data anywhere. Okay, so that is that. That is how you get notified when you want to update your data sources data. Okay, set of views. Yeah, you could add in here background color or something like that, but we have set it to white and I do like the white background color. We are going to set the navigation items title to be newsfeed. Yeah, you could change this to anything or you could just simply remove it. Setup animator, as I have shown you earlier, we can set a lot of animations, and basically we are setting the collection views animator property to the collection view animator. Let me just jump right up here, and as you can see here we have our animator types. Okay, let's just go back. Now providers, because this is where it all comes together. So this is quite a huge function, but we will go through it step by step. First of all, let's create a provider for section 0, and that is will be a basic provider with our data source, view source and size source that we have created. So that is our provider, and we are going to link it to the provider that we have set up in the CollectionViewController here in just a second. But before we do that, we want to set the layout to the section 0 provider layout, and let's just jump to our definition here, and that is a flow layout. Now let's just, before we move even further, I know this is kind of complicated, but let's just talk about the layout, and that is pretty simple. We have some insets, and that is the insets that we have set up. Let me just jump to our definition here in our cell provider, and we add those insets, section 0 provider insets, to our flow layout. And the spacing, we need to add two things for, well, maybe three for our flow layout. Our spacing, there we go. Let me just jump again so you may clearly see where it all is set up. Here we go. And we can justify the content to the start and center. You just go ahead and tweak to your liking. And we can optionally add insets. And these are the insets, okay? And optionally we can have transposed. Now, transposed means is that they are not set up line by line like so. The order is like so. That is pretty simple. So if you have a lot of lines, then it will be, or a lot of space here, it will be, well, you could use transposed for some kind of weird project or something like that. Okay, let's just jump back to our setup provider function and move on. Yeah, we have our section 0 provider and we have set a layout on it. Now we want to create a composed provider because we don't want to have only one section, and we will cover that in the next video. We want to have two sections, but for now we create a sections provider that has only one section, and here we have this array of sections providers. Okay, now we finally we need to create a composed provider. Now why is that important? That is important because we need to have a header, and with the composed header provider we add our header, and that we will provide our header view source, header size source, and the sections that will follow that header. Okay, and this is basic stuff. We are setting our view updater for our closure view source. We are creating a closure view source. We are setting our delegate as with our cell, and we are guardlet unwrapping our data, and we populate the header with that data. Finally, we add our header size source. That again is we need to talk about this max size, because we can grab this max size and we can get the width of the max size or the height. This time we will have the width, so we want to set the cell size of the header to be the maximum of width, and the header cell height, as we have let's just jump into definition. We have set it to 150. If you don't want the header to be shown, just simply set this to 0. And finally, we want to add the sections for this header, composed header provider, and that is the sections provider, and that's that sections property. Okay, finally, let's add a layout to our composed provider, and we have talked about that earlier. And then we set the header composer, and let me just jump into that. We have created this header composer all the way up. It is a composed header provider with the instapost header cell, so that is where you set the cell type. We set this to be the composed provider, and finally with the provider we set this to the composed provider, and optionally we set the header to be sticky or non-sticky. I have set it to false. So this set header sticky is all the way down here, and basically it says the header composer is sticky property to the value that we have just set up here, and this is false. This is an awesome feature of CollectionKit. Now let's talk about this navigation, because this is optional, but most probably you will have a navigation controller in your app. So we are going to set up our navigation items, and I have some well, pre-made lines here, let's call them. First of all, let's take a look at the bar bottom item 1. I have created a bar bottom with a title. You could also create it with an image like so. Of course, you need to change image name here if to your desired image. Okay, and here we have our selector, and there it is. Well, basically what this does is when you tap on this bar bottom item, it will execute the code in here, and we have for the item 2 tapped 2, of course it is commented out. Okay, let's talk about the setup navigation items. First of all, we can set the left bar bottom item or the right bar button. Okay, I have set the right bar. Okay, as an option, you could have more buttons, and here we got the code for set left bar button items, and here we have an array, and the same goes for the right bar button items. Now you could set, this is optional, and it is quite hard to find on the internet on Stack Overflow, so I have added in here just for your convenience. We can hide the back bar button, and that is navigation item.hides back button equals true, and that basically removes that back or with a button from the navigation item. And if you don't want to remove it, but you don't want to have the previous view controller's title to be shown, then you can set the bar bottom item to be any bar bottom item. I have set it to item 1. So that's that for setting up our navigation items, and here you have your handlers when those buttons are tapped. And that's it. That is the finish of our collection view controller. I know this has been quite a lot, but bear with me. Go ahead and rewatch the whole episode if you want to, because in the next video I will be creating another section. So we are not going to create a new controller, because you have seen it in the previous video. We are going to create and add a whole new section below this instapost section. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. Now it is your turn. How would you structure, if otherwise, this newsfeed controller or these sections that I have shown you today? Go ahead. I'm pretty curious how I did my job. Go ahead and leave your comments down below. And as usual, I will see you in the next one.